Hey, everybody, welcome back to Grain Markets and Other Stuff. Thank you for joining me. If you guys are listening on the podcast, remember to subscribe. If you are watching on YouTube, should subscribe to the channel, like these videos. We've got some more kind of hardcore grain marketing information for you today. I'm back with Chris Barron, and we're going to talk about 2022 a little bit. Chris, you've been traveling quite a bit, I'm told.
That's right. I've been kind of living on the road here the last over a month or so, except for the weekends, I guess I get to go home. But we've been traveling on both sides of the Mississippi, and there's a big dividing line from what we've really seen. It's not so bad as you get into eastern Iowa for a ways, but then as you head west, it starts to get pretty rough looking in Iowa. And then there's a stretch kind of in the eastern part of Nebraska that doesn't look too bad. Then as you head west in Nebraska, it gets pretty rough. And of course, North Dakota and South Dakota's got some good pockets, but a lot of the areas are pretty rough.
So you've seen a lot about the crop, and what you've also seen, and really what you're doing on the road is you are compiling more data when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
farm budgets, input costs, that sort of thing. And you've got a whole bunch of real world examples in regard to 2022, how these corn and soybean budgets are going to look. And we did an update on this. It would have been a couple months ago now, I think. But
Right.
we thought it would be a good idea to come back and revisit this because you've got a lot more information. So what have you learned here over the last several weeks in regard to budgets?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think we saw some ebb and flow with the market, and that slowed some sales down. And then with this recent report and things, I think just in talking to people here in this last week, it's been interesting to see. I think people are recognizing that it's probably a good thing if we're not caught up on marketing. There's some opportunities for some pretty high level returns. We haven't seen levels like this since 2012 for what we're seeing in 2021. And I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of concern out there when we show up to a producer's place about, well, I'm not selling any 22 because I don't have any clue where my costs are going to be. I'm not sure what my rotation is going to be. And there's a lot of excuses for not putting numbers together for 2022. And I think you really got to put some numbers together so that you can make an advised decision, or at least have something to guide your decision making for 22.
So the general idea and what we learned the last time we talked is that input costs are going to rise drastically next year. We
Mm-hmm.
have lower board prices available to us when we talk D's 22 corn, Nov 22 beans versus what's available this year. So you're tightening things on both ends of the spectrum here. Higher inputs, yet lower output costs, essentially in the
Mm-hmm.
price of the commodities, which leaves us with a little bit different situation for 22.
That's for sure. And I think that's the biggest concern is the unknown, or the fear
Hmm.
of the unknown. And so the only way you can kind of fix that is to start having conversation with suppliers, start getting some of those numbers together, and we can go through that here and show you some of the details of some of the things that we're starting to discover. But the one thing I would say is that we're seeing pretty good uh, rate of return in almost every scenario when we roll out into 22. When we use the 21 numbers, we increase the costs of production. As long as we grow a normal crop, I think it shows that 22 is going to be a pretty good year. And I think financially, it's going to be a pretty good year for a lot of people as well, simply for the fact that a lot of this grain in 21 is sold at a higher price. There's going to be some deferred pay and some things, and there's going to be money that's going to get rolled into 22 just because of tax reasons. They're going to take all the income in this year. So financially, I think 22 is going to be a good year almost no matter what for most producers that have a decent crop, or that had sufficient crop insurance coverage in the areas that don't have a good crop.
There's a couple
Because
things about 22 that really scare me a lot when it comes to like maybe factors in the outside markets or factors that are beyond our control. The
right.
Fed is talking about hiking interest rates in 2023. What
Hmm.
impact does that have on the price of inputs and every commodity?
Right.
Borrowing costs. Once we get through this COVID, if COVID ever ends, I mean, if we get through COVID and get the supply chain back to normal, what does that mean? There's just a lot of things like into next year that are scary and potentially volatile in regard to inputs and commodity prices and all sorts of different things.
Right. Yeah. And it's, you talk about interest rates. The other thing that we see, and we'll show you that here in a minute, but we're seeing a pretty significant amount of additional cash that needs to be available next year because of that increase. So, your working capital position is going to improve going into 22, but it's going to require outlay that a person's going to need to put out there. So that's another consideration for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So do you want to show us an updated version of some of the numbers and
Yep.
what we're looking at? All right, I'm going to share your screen here, and we've got your budget sheet up. Talk about some of the big changes that you're seeing, or some of the things that really stick out to you here.
Right. So I'm going to kind of look on another screen here as I kind of point these things out. Can you see my mouse on here?
No, but go ahead.
Okay, I'll just kind of explain it. And then also if there's people listening that kind of understand what we're talking about here. But some of the things that we're seeing is as we go through 21 first and foremost, what we look at is return to management. As you look at that return to management category right now, we're seeing basically about the same number we had last time when I talked with you. We haven't seen much of a change there in 21. It's about $55 an acre. What
Hey,
that
Chris, give me a quick definition of how you define return to management, just very
Yep,
briefly.
that's exactly where I was going. So it basically what return to management is your draws, paying yourself, paying your employees, your utilities, your your health insurance expenses, all of those kind of things that the farm has to write a check for. That so often we hear people talk about cost of production and they exclude those expenses. And the way we do the math, we have to cover every expense that the operation or the business has before we look at a true cost of production. So for example, are you in control of that? Can you go to the corn page? Because it looks like we're on the soybean page.
No,
right
that's
now.
on your end.
Okay. How do we do that? Move your mouse to the right screen. Oh, okay. Here we go. So as now, can you see my mouse?
No, and I'm still seeing the soybean page.
Okay. So, all right, here we go to the corn page.
There we go.
Right. So what we're looking at is that return to management, as I just explained it, that $54 to $55 an acre.
Does that cost vary quite a bit? Because I mean, different operations have more labor, less labor, no labor that they have to pay. I mean, all that sort of
Yes,
stuff.
that's a great question. It does vary a lot. The range that we're seeing right now is anywhere from about I would say from that we saw that's in this database. I don't have that right in front of me, but it's somewhere right around $35 an acre to as high as we have a couple that are pushing 200.
Wow.
But that
That's a big swing.
200, if they're $200 for a return to management, that means their land cost is significantly less, though, because they don't have as much land cost. So they're taking money out of the operation as profit. So they take it out in draws. And so again, that's part of the cost of production, though. If you're pulling money out of the business, that's a cost. And so those are all things we're looking at in the 21. A couple of other things I want to point out in 21, just as a reminder. When you look at the crop insurance, we saw crop insurance go up significantly in 21. We also saw, fertilizer was higher, but not a lot higher. Nitrogen was a touch higher, mainly because not everybody had all of it booked in 21. People like to say they did, but at least in my observation, there was a fair amount of additional nitrogen bought during the growing season this year because of the price, and people were trying to increase yield, so they spent a little bit more money. Machinery and equipment costs are a whole nother one. We just did a podcast on machinery and equipment costs that I'd recommend people go back and look at, where we talk about inflation specifically on equipment. That's something that's a big deal. But this year we didn't see in 21 a big big increase, but we'll talk about that in a second in 22. And, drying, handling, those things we don't really know for sure yet, although LP and some of those things are significantly higher. So as we look at what that looks like going into 22, what we see is a $4.71 on-farm cash price right now. So that of our clients that are in this database, their average selling price for 21 is at $4.71 on corn. So if you look at that average selling price, if they ended up selling everything at that price, we're looking at about a 24% return on investment this year on average. The range we're seeing is anywhere from almost 50% return on investment for those with lower cost productions and lower land costs to, still seeing some break evens. And a lot of that has to do with the areas where the yields are down. This database represents 204 bushel an acre. That's, and again, we have ranges in there from about 80 bushel an acre on the low end to, 260, I think was the high one. So that's kind of the range we're seeing. So then when we roll over into 222, what we do is we take their profit manager, we get all their numbers dialed in very accurately for 21. We roll that over into 22 in this side-by-side comparison and say, okay, let's say we market the grain at $5, which in a lot of areas you can do that right now. Even with basis locked, you can get close to that $5 number in most areas. Now what we're looking at is, with what we project as input price increases, still about 11% return, 10 to 11% rate of returns, which is pretty good. So what that's showing us though is as we look at these percent increases, return to management, we're seeing that go up about 14% into next year. And the reason we can calculate that is we're just taking what people are projecting they're going to spend next year. And then we're also taking inflation into account. And so when you add those two up, when people make more money, they spend more money, right? So when I went back to 2012, that category in 2012 increased by close to 20%. And it only came back down about 5%, so when we make more, we spend more. When we spend more, it's hard to spend less. And again, it's, it comes back to wages, inflation, kids in college, you buy, occasionally people make more money. They accidentally buy a boat, or they, buy something like I mentioned last time that becomes an expense that's kind of there forever. So those are things I think we all got to watch. The biggest one, though, I would say some of these other ones are up. Land rents, we're seeing land rents go up to the tune of about $20 an acre on rent on average. That's about a 7.5% price increase, because when we look at land cost, we have what you pay for the land you own, which is a static number for most cases. But then when you increase the land rent, we have to look at it in terms of a percentage, and that's about 7.5% from what we're seeing right now. Seed, it looks like seed's going to be up anywhere from about 6 to 9%, depending on the company. Fertilizer, P&K is up about 40% in most areas. We see at some areas where it's quite a bit higher than that, some areas where it's a little lower for whatever reason. Nitrogen's up right at about 100%. We're at 98%. So it's about 100% more than what it was last year at the same time.
That's quite the increase.
Yeah, that's the
biggest line item change percentage wise you got there.
Yeah, by far. I mean, that's a $76 an acre increase on corn. So I want to talk about that in a second too. But then the other things we're seeing, is machinery and equipment. This machinery and equipment is up. Used equipment's up about 5 to 6%. New machinery is up about 7 to 8% across the board on average. So, if people are buying machinery, which is what we're seeing happen now, because people have good prices, it looks like they're going to make good money. A lot of people made good money last year. So the demand is there and the supply is not. So, that's creating that inflation on the equipment. And then the drying cost, LP and your energy costs are up. Over on the soybean side, real quick, we're seeing essentially the same thing. want to show you one key thing that's interesting on rotation that people are going to consider, I think, for next year. But right now we're about 58 bushel average bean yield on our database for our clients that are in this group. We're looking at a cost of production of about 1040, where next year we're looking at a cost of production of about 1135 on soybeans. Again, these costs are all dialed in. If anybody wants to see these things, they can email me, and I definitely would share this data where we're at so far anyway. But if you look at this return to management, all these numbers are the same. The absent thing is you obviously don't need nitrogen for soybeans. And so our cost increase on soybeans with all those factors in terms of percentage being the same relative to corn, we're seeing a cost increase per acre of $55 an acre on soybeans to produce soybeans, or we're seeing about $1 a bushel of cost increase. If you go back to the corn for a second and we look at that, what we're seeing there is $140 an acre cost of production increase, or about 68 cents a bushel. And so what I've been hearing from a lot of producers when we do this exercise and we look at what the numbers are at, I think there's a lot of interest in soybeans right now where guys can shift over to soybeans next year because of that cost increase relative to corn versus soybeans.
And a lot of that has to do with just the nitrogen cost itself.
Right. And then if you look
at,
and if you look at the profitability per acre, if we look at soybeans, a person can lock in $73 an acre, but you still have to look at corn. Look at this. I mean, you can make $100 an acre on corn. So you want to be really careful when people say, well, I think I want to grow beans because my cost increase is 140 versus 55, but you still have to look at the margin, right? So you got to say, okay, what's the price? So if you're dealing with $5 corn, and I've got in here 1262 soybeans. So that price spread between corn and soybeans is going to be critical to a big piece of that equation as to when you start looking at crop rotation going into next year as to what you want to be selling, what you want to be marketing. But in a lot of cases, especially in the I states, it still looks advantageous for corn from a profitability standpoint, even though the cost is quite a bit higher. But obviously you got to take into account, your agronomic decisions and your a lot of those kind of things. So it's just really interesting, and it is very different from one farm to the next. I'll be at one farm and it does show that there's more profitability in soybeans. I'll go to the next farm in a different state and it's the other way around. So, we all have to make sure we put our own numbers in here. I mean, I'm showing you averages. The one thing I think that is a constant, though, and I think that we're pretty accurate on, is these price increases as a percent. So, when you look at this from the standpoint of we're seeing an 8% increase, on cost of production for soybeans, and we're seeing a 15% increase for a cost of production on corn. So, will those numbers change some? Yeah, I think they're going to change a little bit. In fact, I think they're going to go up a touch as we continue. We got about another probably 3 weeks of grower meetings, and we'll continue to put data in here. But again, I stress the importance of doing this yourself, because you can start, if you start doing some marketing, you got to be thinking about the logistics for 22. You got to be thinking about your agronomics for 22, and you got to think about your cost of production, for 22. The last thing I want to point out real quick, though, too, is, and I'm going to come down here if I can get this to show up. Our average client on corn has a acre base of, if I can get this to go, has an acre base of 2,087 acres. And so basically what we're seeing is you got to look at how much additional cash flow needs to be there. So that average 2,000 acre corn guy is going to need an additional, $290,000. So if you just change this to like a 500 acre producer, You put 500 acres in there. That producer is going to need, bear with me for a second. I put 500 in both of them. So if that producer is 500 acres, that producer needs another $70,000 to operate. So what you really got to be thinking about is, where last year it took you our average producer $775 an acre to put a crop in. With those price increases on corn, it's going to take about $900 to put that same crop in. So your working capital position that has improved this year needs to be considered going into 22, so that you have that cash available, or understand that if you're going to be spending that money and you're going to borrow that money from the bank, then your interest cost is going to go up as well because you're borrowing more money. And so, in the same effect, I won't go through that exercise on the soybeans, but the same thing is true there, and so those are all considerations we have to look at. We got to look at, what is our percent increase? What is our cost per acre increase? What is our cost on a per bushel basis? And how much more cash are we going to need to, to put our crop in next year relative to our crop rotation, corn, soybeans, or wheat, whatever it is, or other crops for that matter.
If I'm looking at this the right way, it looks like these cost of production numbers, at least in corn, that's up from where it was when we talked 2 months ago.
Yeah, it's come up some just because some more of the costs were up. The last time I talked to you, we had nitrogen at about, I think, 50% higher.
Yeah.
And that was just because of the data that I had in there. I didn't have, I hadn't got enough data. We're to the point now where I don't think it's going to change very much. It's sort of like when you're doing the price discovery period during the month of October for crop insurance, you get to about the 20th of October, the number's not going to change much the rest of the time. And I'm pretty sure that's the case here. The only thing that I'm concerned about going up in cost of production more is the return to management category, because when you fill your vehicle with gas, or when you buy utility stuff and you look at just all these things that are going up in price, I think that category, and I think people are going to spend more money too.
Yeah, we don't know if those increases are going to stop or if they continue for another year or 2 years. I mean, if this
Right.
inflation deal continues, it could get substantially worse, I guess.
Right. And and I would say the other side of this that's interesting is, when you look at the inflation piece of this, of that 14%, close to half of that is probably inflation. The other half of that's just increase in spending. And
Yeah.
so if inflation keeps going up, I think that's what's going to be the driver. And that's what's different compared to 2012, when we saw return to management expenses go up quite a bit in 2012. It took till about 2015 till those numbers came back down, and they only came back down about halfway. But we didn't have an inflation scenario going on then. That was a spending deal for most of us. We made good money in 2012 and in 2013 because we had a cash spillover effect. And the same thing's going to happen again going into 22. Like I said in the beginning of the conversation, we're going to see a cash spillover effect in 22. And if people are not doing accrual analysis, either by virtue of doing that in their accounting system or using some kind of a tool like Profit Manager, and there's lots of other tools out there. You don't have to use Profit Manager, but you need to be using something that shows your accrual, what's really going on in real time in your business, so that you're making the best decisions, from everything from marketing to purchasing inputs. And again, I think managing that crop rotation next year is going to be a key component to people maximizing profitability in 22.
And of course, when it comes to grain marketing, I mean, our concern here when it comes to next year is that, first of all, like we talked about earlier, the board prices are cheaper. And if the board prices were to fall from these sort of levels between now and, say, the end of February, when we've got a crop insurance price, there's some substantial risk here when you're laying out all these input costs, but you have really no clue what the outputs. I mean, you know what it could be, but if you haven't acted on it or done something about it, there's substantially more risk here.
Yeah, and that's where, I almost wonder if in some form or fashion as producers, if we're not willing to do some like hedge to arise on some percentage or something to try to figure out how do we start to put a floor in this because of the risk that's there. Because there's, like you said, if you got to go from, in 21 spending 700 and or 750 or $775 an acre putting the crop in, and you're going to have to spend $900 to $920 an acre next year to put it in. Boy, that downside risk is a scary thing if we go and buy the inputs and we don't protect the other side. Because I know there's a lot of people right now that are going ahead and buying fertilizer. They're buying some of the nitrogen because they're afraid it's going to go up more. And, is it going to come back down? I don't know. But if you go back and look in history, it normally doesn't going into that next year.
Right.
And so, I mean, I don't know how to predict that. I just know that if you lock in one side of the equation, you better start figuring out how to manage risk on the other side, because that's true margin management. And and if you look at that, I mean, we can make 10% return next year, even if people started, if you've got your land and your machinery pretty well locked in, and you're a producer that doesn't have a lot of land price increases, and machinery is pretty constant, you probably have maybe as much as 50% of your cost of production is locked in. And so, protecting the other side of that equation, I think, is smart. Whether it's, there's obviously, and Joe, you're the one to ask on the tools, but you could be doing some hedge to arrives, you could be selling some of it, you could even lock in basis on some of it and be in the black, at least on that percentage. And maybe some options or just some things somehow to protect that downside.
Yeah, marketing is there's a lot of different ways you can protect downside, but 2022 is interesting because we don't know anything about 22. We don't know what acreage is going to be. We don't know what demand is going to be. All we know for the moment is that our input costs are rising substantially. The board price and the cash bids out there for 22 allow us to make money now, but that
Right.
doesn't have to be the case 2, 3, 4 months from now.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. I just talked to a producer last night, actually, that he ran his numbers. He's literally going to plant 100% soybeans next year.
Yeah.
So there's going to be some interesting decisions. Excuse me. There's going to be some interesting decisions being made with producers, and this producer's in an area where a lot of growers grow all corn on corn. So he's got a situation where he's had 7 or 8 years of all corn. So he's going to have a pretty good bean yield opportunity. So that's why I said everybody's really got to run these numbers, and they need to be talking to you and figuring out how do we protect the downside of the risk here, I think is key.
Chris, great information as always. If anybody watching or listening would like some additional info from you, what should they do?
They can send me an email at cbarron@agviewsolutions.com. And, this is a tool that I think is something that if people want to take a look at that and say, okay, plug your numbers in 21 and at least get a look at what's the impact of 22, I think it shows you a lot of information. So,
guys, I'm going to put the link to Chris's website in the YouTube description, and he should be pretty easy to get a hold of. Chris, thanks again. Guys, we'll catch you next time.
Sounds